Thank you so much for being here. I feel so happy and honored for keeping learning with and from this group. And I'm so happy that we have the chance to keep discussing this topic. There was a very nice moment back there in the conference from Cergy-Paris where we look at each other with some complicity of like, okay, this resonates a lot with what we are going to tell now and what we are going to keep discussing. So it's a great connection. I'm very happy about that. And so I think so far it is already clear that with the advance of the far right in European countries as a context, today we are confronting a very pressing issue. That is the growing threats to gender, reproductive, and LGBTQI+ rights across Europe. And actually, we want to pick up again a characteristic of this kind of movements that Stephen mentioned in the first roundtable. That is its transnational character. In organizations such as World Congress of Family or Citizen Go and like big movements like anti-abortion, March for Life, we can see this transnational characteristic, which means that these narratives keep reproducing in a lot of different countries. These mentioned threats are driven, of course, by extremist gender narratives that are rooted in outdated 19th century ideas about gender roles and the so-called natural order. And these narratives were once mainstream, and right now we are understanding them as radical, but they have been definitely revived and politicized by modern actors. So we need to take a look at the past so we can start understanding the present. As well, they are a characteristic that has been mentioned before as well. It is that they are tied to religious influences and often intersected, as we heard fantastically in the previous conference, with other forms of extremism, such as anti-immigration and Islamophobia. And far-right parties have weaponized these ideas, framing them as a battle between us and them, seeking to roll back decades of progress in gender equality. We've seen three key waves of resurgence in these narratives. First, in the 80s, as a backlash against feminist movements. In the 2000s, with opposition to LGBTQI+ rights. And more recently, following the Me Too movement. And that has sparked a renewish push against feminists again. Now I am very happy to introduce here my colleagues in this table, and together we are gonna revise different case studies, and hopefully by understanding them, we can suggest new ways of counteract with these narratives. We're gonna start first of all with Paolo Gusmeroli, researcher sociologist at the University of Padova. His areas of expertise are family sociology and conflicts on sexual citizenship in the public debate. In Arenas, our project, he works on the Italian case, and he will talk about how anti-gender rhetoric has gone beyond its Catholic roots in Italy. Then we will hear Claudia Jareño. She works at the University of Cergy as a researcher and historian. Her areas of expertise are gender studies, the feminist movements, and currently the relationship between far-right and anti-feminism. She's the coordinator of the section of anti-gender narratives for the Arenas report on the historical roots of extremism. Within the Arenas project, she works on French cases. And she will explore the shifts and continuities in extremist anti-gender narratives in France and in the last decades. Actually, that's one of the triggers of those complicity looks that we were talking about before. Then we will hear Isidora Grubački. She's a historian specializing in the history of interwar feminisms and women's political thought with the focus on Yugoslavia. She works at the Institute of Contemporary History in Ljubljana, and she's also a project member of the ERC-funded project HERC, the history of feminist political thought and women's rights discourses in East Central Europe at the University of Vienna. And she will talk about how feminism and nationalism intertwined in the case of Croatia and Serbia. And last but not least, we will hear Gwenaëlle Bauvois, a researcher sociologist at the University of Helsinki. Her areas of expertise are the far-right conspiracy and the post-truth politics. In Arenas, our project, she works both on the Finnish and French cases in Work Package 3 and Work Package 4. She coordinated the gender section of the report on the historical roots of extremism narratives in Europe, together with Claudia. And she will explore the paradox of gender equality in Finland. So, please, Paolo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I will try to link at least a little bit with the previous presentation, saying that my idea is to present how anti-gender politics, more than also narratives, have been normalized within the Italian context. In order to do so, I would like to, first I limit myself to consider the conservative version of the anti-gender politics, as in Italy as elsewhere we also have this new or assumed new gender critical of TERF feminism that has come out and has contributed to the rhetoric circulating. But I want to show how the recent circulation of anti-gender narratives in two ways, from religious to secular, and from the self-representation of the extreme in terms of political positioning to so-called moderate, assumed, self-represented as moderate political stances, is of course self-representation. And I think this operation is relevant to problematize how old-fashioned anti-feminist and anti-LGBT claims, that in Italy are nothing new, assume a renewed meaning in the Italian contemporary context and a new positioning in the political space. As I said, for a matter of time, I limit my presentation to the political conservative space and actors, where, simplifying a little bit, we can detect three main versions, three main streams of anti-gender politics and narratives. And of course, these three streams may sometimes overlap, coincide, or converge, or also diverge, at least a little bit in some cases. Okay, the first version is the traditional one, is the one promoted from the Vatican. We know that the very idea of gender ideology was nominated in the Vatican documents back in the 90s, on occasion of the UN Conference of Beijing. This operation, giving a name to gender ideology that at the beginning was nominated simply as the ideological use of the concept of gender, was accompanied by at least two significant strategies that were already there in the mid-90s. First, associate new standard of sexual citizenship to forms of Western hegemony and neoliberal colonialism. So we've been talking about neo-colonial feminism, and now we make a mess with the terms, because also from conservative side there's the denounce of a neoliberal feminism, but it's another one. Okay, constructing alliances based on that principle. Okay. Second, distinguishing between a legitimate and a non-legitimate feminism, namely the so-called feminism of difference was a good one, the other one was not, the constructivist was not a good one. So the gender-critical feminist debate we see today was already there more than 30 years ago. So the relevant point in this case is that, coming to narratives, is that the Vatican insisted, still insists with Pope Francis, on the frame of a colonization driven by the global north. So even Pope Francis from time to time keeps recalling both official and informal statements that gender ideology is the ugliest danger of today's world, a colonizing ideology, or even a neoliberal ideology colonizing the world. A second relevant point related to these narratives is that this discourse is produced and circulates also among Catholic people and groups that consider themselves as democratized and pluralistic. They would not label themselves as extremists, and in many cases they recognize themselves as politically center-left or even progressive. So this is the first, and this is, as you may imagine, this is very relevant to bring anti-gender politics from the far right to a much widespread political space and audience. Second stream of anti-gender politics is related to the just mentioned anti-gender and pro-life organization. Is more or less the same we see in any national context. They play, as it were, a relevant role in mobilizing apparent roots mobilization. So they are organized protests in schools, in the streets, and so on. So they are very active in the mobilization work. And in Italy, they became visible only since 2013, when we actually imported the formula from the Manif pour tous from France. And nowadays, they are different organizations and groups with strong transnational links, but also with the possibility to a widespread of distribution of the territory thanks to Catholic networks or political networks at local level. Their ability, as elsewhere, is to combine renovated, modernized vocabularies, that's to say, in some cases adopting self-victimizing, paranoid, conspirational tones, or even co-opting or converging with gender-critical feminism, with old-fashioned anti-feminist and homophobe stances. Referring to them, literature has also detected a small paradox. On the one side, if you look at them within the Catholic space, they represent a kind of neo-radicalization of the religious space. So, for example, until a few years ago, they were relatively marginal within the same Catholic space because they are too radical, and from time to time they are, for example, to make an example, very critical toward this pope that is deemed to be too progressive and so on. On the other side, they are responsible to have secularized the anti-gender narratives in the public sphere. So they go on two parallel planes. So they move from religious to secular frameworks depending on the audience they are targeting. For example, they organize protests presenting themselves as common parents, people without flags, apolitical, non-denominational, and so on. The third kind of neoconservative anti-gender politics is the one related to far-right nationalist parties as the Lega Nord or Fratelli d'Italia. In this case, the opposition, to gender ideology is more directly linked to the idea of nation, but what is relevant to note, as in other contexts, is that they use it, anti-gender, to rewrite the political space, to say other positions are the radical one, and this is also used to banalize, for example, the historical experience of fascism, and to project the stigma of radicalism on the liberal left associated to the foolishness of gender, on the gender ideology. To conclude, as we said, in Italy, we know that opposition to gender is still animated by religious organization. However, we may assume that even in Italy, anti-gender narratives does not need religious grounds to get legitimacy. On the contrary, religious arguments are often relegated in the background, at least when it comes to public visibility and when it comes to address a broader public. The final point is the main result is the possibility to rewrite the political space. This is one of the main points. So placing themselves in the center, as they've been for 50 years with the Democrazia Cristiana, and trying to say other are the radicals, other are the extremists, and we are not. And we are pluralistic, and we are the one that can manage what is a good modernity or a gone too far modernity. So we are like in the right place to govern modernity. And I had other things, but time is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paolo. It was not supposed to sound. Thank you so much for this interesting case. Now we're gonna hear the case of France with Claudia. Please, Claudia.
Yes, this works. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Ana Yara. I have to say it's a little complicated to me to talk after Sarah Farri, so I will do my best. So first of all, extremist anti-gender narrative have a long-standing history in France, as in many Western countries. Maybe at that time, this anti-gender narrative were not considered as extremists, but mainstream, because they are very, this narrative were mainstream, but this narrative become extremist. So in the 20th century, the National Front, le Front National, a far-right party founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen in 1972, was one of the protagonists in developing and spreading extremist anti-gender narrative in France. The Front National went back to old-fashioned ideas about traditional heterosexual family and the role of white women as housewives and mothers. However, for the past 12 years, since Marie Le Pen became president of the party, we have seen the Front National adopt a more moderate stand over certain issues such as gay rights or abortion. For many researchers, for many scholars, as far as Saris, this new position has been interpreted as part of a new strategy to whitewash the party image in order to become more acceptable to the public. No, this contributes to the diabolisation du parti. Other examples of this strategy include the party new name, Rassemblement National, or the recognition of the Holocaust. Yes, thank you. Secondly, it's also important to note that when we talk about the far right in France today, we are not only referring to the Rassemblement National, but also to a whole cluster, whole constellation of small groups ranging from ultranationalist groups, masculinist groups, to Catholic fundamentalistic. No, you can see these new groups. So these groups are taking up a more reactionary anti-gender narrative than the traditional right and ultra-conservative far right. This group advocate for a return to traditional gender values, the return of women to the domestic space, or the defense of larger families. It's interesting to realize that some groups don't define themselves as conservative or far right, but as restitutionist. That is to say, they advocate for a return to a pre-capitalist past order where the values of femininity and masculinity has not been altered by liberalism. They also criticize cultural relativism and wide range of values attached to the so-called woke culture. In general, this extremist anti-gender narrative should not only be understood as a counter-narrative against progress in gender equality, but also as a more general opposition to leftist ideology against an supposed intellectual and academic elite. Among this group, we can observe the rather important presence of young women, most of them very active on social media and on certain television channels. As is the case of YouTuber Thaïs Descoufon, journalist Eugénie Bastier, and Française Solveig Mineo, and Alice Cordier, president of the feminist identity collective Nemesis. In some cases, they consider themselves to be feminist. Sometimes they consider present themselves as against feminists. So it's very interesting, this rhetoric. We have to note that since the start of the Manif pour tous, demonstration against gay marriage in 2012, a number of far-right groups calling themselves white feminists have emerged. These groups defend the superiority of Western culture. They also use the vocabulary that was previously used by feminists. women's autonomy, women's right, freedom of choice, so again, the word freedom, to promote a reactionary anti-gender message. So to conclude, we can say that today in France, within the far right, extremist anti-gender narratives are moving in two directions. On the one hand, some aspects of extremist anti-gender rhetoric have been transformed by the Rassemblement National, making its anti-gender rhetoric more secular and more moderate, close to femonationalism. And on the other hand, new far-right groups are reactivating and taking up more conservative and reactionary extremist anti-gender narrative.
Thank you so much. Very interesting case, definitely. And now we jump into the cases of Serbia and Croatia. Thank you, Isidora.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction earlier. And I just realized that I forgot to put the pictures on the slide, but maybe it's even better. You don't have to look at the right-wing people's faces. So my focus in this project was on historical roots of extremist narratives in Serbia and Croatia, the two former Yugoslav countries. And the situation there is actually quite similar to the other cases that were discussed in the project and also in this panel. On the one hand, there is a trend of recycling old tropes of conservative and patriarchal attitudes toward gender equality. And on the other hand, it might seem that there is an attempt to offer a bit more progressive view on gender equality and to make these right-wing and nationalist movements look slightly more progressive. So I would now like to give a couple of examples about the extremist narratives in these two countries, and actually most of the cases will be from Serbia, and show that even when the narratives are seemingly not anti-feminist, they nevertheless end up being such. So if we look at the extremist narratives regarding gender in this context today, in some cases there is not an outright negation of women's rights or equality. The discourse is such that it focuses on the support for family values, for motherhood privileges, tax reliefs for families. These, of course, might be useful to women, but what is important when analyzing these extremist narratives is not only what is said, because sometimes what is said is not harmful in itself, but we have to think of the context in which it is said. And the context to this is that these issues are discussed almost always or always in isolation from other important problems which the feminist activists have been predominantly focusing on, such as violence against women, femicide, and abortion. In contrast to feminist discourses and themes, extremist narratives are almost always connected to and subsumed to the idea of nation and family. And this is why also it's, we heard earlier in the lecture that sexual harassment by, in most cases, is by a relative. So this is why it's so difficult to actually discuss it when then you have to actually talk about the problems in the family. Then to give another example, the leader of the right-wing party, Srpska stranka Zavetnici, Serbian party Oath Keepers, who is also since May of this year the Ministry for Family and Demography in Serbia, Milica Đurđević-Stamenkovski. She claims that she supports women and women's rights, but actually if you look at her discourses, the dominant element of her narratives is always the opposition to the independence of Kosovo and Serbian nationalism. That is, rather than women's rights, her discourses are primarily anti-Albanian and ethnic nationalistic. And this is the framework of her more recent discussions of demography and family as well, as the concepts she used when discussing her own family also were all conservative concepts of heart of home and her descendants, etc. So she uses this very old language in a way when she talks about family. Then the context is also, to these narratives, is also anti-LGBTQI plus narrative. In both Serbia and Croatia, the family values are in most cases opposed to what they call the LGBT and gender ideology. And there are many examples for this, like recently the mayor of Belgrade's manifestation Family Days organized this as a counter event to the Pride Parade. And in the case of this like family days, yes, it's talked in a way about women, but everything about women's rights is narrowed down to those of mothers, and the narratives about families are used as weapons against the rights of different marginalized groups. Many narratives actually use the language of human rights and democracy to oppose the basic human rights to the LGBTQI+ community. So for instance, as a response to the 2022 Euro Pride and the 2023 Pride in Belgrade, the far-right party Dveri argued that this was an, quote, anti-democratic violence of a minority against a majority. And they made explicit differentiation between, on the one hand, human rights, traditional values, and help and support to family, and on the other hand, the LGBT propaganda. So it's very obvious how they are kind of using this human rights language in this way. Abortion, as mentioned, is a big part of extremist narratives, actually anti-abortion claims, and it's seen as something which is endangering family. However, it is important to note that the narratives are often built on actually wrong information and deliberately wrong information. For instance, the minister that I mentioned earlier, in November 2023, said in the pre-election campaign that 100,000 abortions happen in Serbia every year, and then she continued to build argument on that. But actually, the number that she reported was more than 10 times bigger. So overall, even when seemingly well-meaning, these narratives are extremist in the way that they exclude the LGBTQI+ groups, but also women, because only one part of their problems is talked about, that connected to family, whereas other issues that might more openly challenge the patriarchal society are never mentioned, and because of that, such focus is put on the rights of women as mothers. However, I argue that there are limits actually to these kinds of narratives, which somehow always fall short once they are challenged by reality. And to illustrate this, I will give one last example about a recent so-called scandal related to, again, the aforementioned minister, Milica Đurđević, so the Minister of Family and Demography, to repeat. In late July this year, there was a big problem in Serbia where the temperature went over 40 degrees Celsius, and it was extremely hot as everywhere. And there were testimonies that in one of the central maternity hospitals in Belgrade, women who were just about to give labor or had just given birth were literally crying on hallways because of the heat, and they couldn't stand it. There was some AC, but it was not really working. And on social network, people started putting on photos, and they started demanding that the ministry solves this issue. And to this, the ministry responded by donating several, like 10 or something ventilators to one clinic in Belgrade. And this was supposed to be a good PR move or something like that, but it actually backlashed in a way. Additional context to this is that before that, many women had testified about the high rate of violence during the labor from the side of doctors and nurses in Serbia and across the region, actually. And feminist activists have been arguing on the basis of this increased number of women who went public about their maltreatment during labor across the region, that this had actually been a problem over decades. And even a petition, which was called Stop to the Obstetric Violence, was given to the Ministry of Health this year with 200,000 signatures, which was ignored, basically. And it was in this context that the minister's ventilator solution was not only criticized by the public, but she was extremely ridiculed for it on social network and in media and everywhere. I mean, not the pro-regime media, but the other side. And in response, she negated all these problems, and the Minister for Demography and Family, and she said that, quote, for 20 years there has been a campaign against the birth of children in Serbia, and it is a part of the global agenda. This is why obstetric violence, bad conditions in maternity hospitals, and bad food are highlighted. This is why they persistently insist on these problems. So what this example shows us is the inability of the advocates of the extremist narratives to respond to the reality, actually, and the lack of any kind of sophisticated response once they are challenged, other than global agenda against the Serbian nation. In other words, the problems that the feminists are pointing to are presented as a part of the global agenda and against the Serbian nation. It's always who is paying them and where are they getting the money and who are they working for. And also, feminist organizations and activists and researchers are entirely missing from their narratives, and as well as the issues that they're advocating for. So, as one journalist rightly argued recently, the message of this statement is actually those who do not like the reality as it is now, those are against the state. And in conclusion, there is not much that is there about women's rights.
Thank you so much. Again, super interesting. To wrap up, we go to a very fascinating case as well.
Hopefully.
With
We are
Gwenaëlle.
moving to a different part of Europe that hasn't been much discussed so far, but is like one of the partners in the Arenas project. So it is Finland. And I dare say that the theme of gender is especially interesting in the Finnish case because historically, Finland has had a very long established gender equality, as you probably know. There's always this image of Northern Europe, Finland, Sweden, as very gender equality oriented. And it is, for instance, the second country in the world to give voting rights for women. We have had very strong politicians like President Tarja Halonen in the 2000s, more recently Prime Minister Sanna Marin. So women have had a lot of importance in society and also in politics. And also within the sphere of far-right politics. For instance, the current leader of the Finns party is a woman, Riikka Purra, and she also serves as a minister in the coalition government at the very moment. So there is this context that is quite specific to Finland. But there is a paradox of gender equality in Finland. On the one hand, of course, the ideological core of the far right is suspicious of gender equality and its connection to feminism and to the so-called gender ideology. But on the other hand, gender equality is also constructed as a national trait and is often seen as a fundamental boundary between us and them. So it's something that is especially strong in the Finnish context. So gender equality is presented as a national characteristic. We could also say an historical characteristic. And it's even part of the Finnishness, of the Finnish identity. And we can find, for instance, the image of the Nordic woman, this ideal of the northern maiden that is constructed. And she is a symbol of gender equality, of course, of this tradition of gender equality, and she represents the ideal of a romantic North, an idealized identity. So this is something that is quite strong, and it's presented as this woman is represented as historically strong, independent, free, resilient, and of course white with blonde hair and blue eyes, obviously having this image. And for instance, the far-right and ethno-nationalist organizations that were founded during the 1990s, such as Suomen Sisu, consider their mission to recognize and defend, quote, gender equality as part of the Northern heritage. So they are, even if they are very ethno-nationalist, they are saying that this is one of our missions to protect this gender equality that is part of our heritage. And gender equality is named as something Nordic, something Finnish, and of course it's qualified against the dangerous others that do not respect gender equality. And the others are, of course, often Muslim men, as it has been explained very well by Sarah Faris in her keynote lecture. And these men are constructed not only as a threat to the nation, but also as a threat to gender equality as a whole, and something that is so precious for Finnish society and Finnish nation. And Finnish culture and Nordic culture in general is historically constructed as secular, woman-friendly, and the Muslim culture is constructed as being religious and patriarchal. So obviously, two different kinds of constructions. And of course, it does not prevent some of the Finnish far-right actors from referring, of course, to Christian values and Christian culture, even if they consider themselves as being secular. There is actually no separation between state and the church. And of course, this is constructed in opposition to other religious culture, which means most of the time Islam. And they are claiming to defend a secular nation. Of course, didn't prevent the Finns party from working hand in hand with the Christian Democrats in the current coalition government. So a lot of contradiction that don't seem to bother them too much. And obviously, as we understand in the Finnish context, gender is strongly embedded in nation building. But the far right presents gender equality, as I said, as a strong characteristic of the Finnish nation, except when they highlight immigration as a threat to female emancipation. So what has been very well explained earlier today. So this is, of course, brings us back to what has been explained about femonationalism, and it's something that we clearly see in the Finnish far right, and this association of a nationalist ideology and some feminist idea, especially driven by xenophobic motivation. And of course, lining up with some of the claim of the feminist movement allows the far right to justify some racist and xenophobic positions, as it has been witnessed, for instance, in the writing of many of the Finns party members that clearly have been using this kind of rhetoric. And in many instances, the Finnish far right is actually positioning itself as the defenders of women, sometimes the sole defenders. For instance, during the 2015-16 refugee crisis, Finnish anti-immigration vigilante groups such as the Soldiers of Odin, I don't know if some of you have heard, they were created in Finland, but they spread not only in Europe, but also in Canada, United States, Australia. So it was this movement that spread all over the place. And the Soldiers of Odin were claiming their goal was to protect white women's honor. And of course, this honor had to be protected against an epidemic of sexual violence allegedly committed by the Muslim refugees. But of course, not all women deserve to be helped, according to them. And not all of them deserve to be protected and respected. They want to protect only the good women, meaning, of course, the Finnish women, white, helpless, compliant. And another example of the neo-fascist and anti-immigration party, Blue and Black movement, they also call for the protection of quote-unquote honorable Finnish women, mothers, daughters, and grandmothers, excluding, of course, all the other non-Finnish and that don't fit to this profile. And so it means that they are excluding part of these women. And which women are they excluding? They are excluding women from the outside, of course, but also autochthonous women who are considered as not being part of the in-group and not being honorable, which means green and leftist women, feminist, and traitor who mix their blood with foreigners. And I'm quoting that this is straight from a text from a member of the Finns party that was published on the website of their think tank, Suomen Perusta. So calling them exactly with these terms. And according to former Finns party leader, Jussi Halla-aho, who is like really a big figure in this party, for him, this type of women, in his view, do not deserve assistance. And he even suggested that they might deserve to be sexually assaulted by immigrants to teach them a lesson. So that was the leader of the party writing that on his blog. He was, of course, prosecuted for that. So to conclude, while the Finnish far right may attempt to present itself as champions of gender equality, women's rights, and emancipation, of course, a closer examination really reveals that these seemingly progressive stances are largely superficial, of course. And beneath that facade, their views often fail to align with genuine advocacy for women's empowerment, serving more as a veneer to appear more mainstream and to attract a broader support rather than a genuine concern for women's empowerment. And just to conclude, since its inception, one of the objectives of the Finns Party has been to maintain traditional gender norms while actively opposing what they call gender ideology. So, for instance, the Finns Party think tank that I just mentioned, Suomen Perusta, has openly voiced its opposition to feminism and the perceived threats posed by the so-called dangerous gender ideology. And their stance reflects a broader ideological commitment to preserving conventional gender roles and countering progressive movements that advocate for gender equality, but of course also for LGBTQ+ rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I find fascinating how we take a look at Europe and different cases and how sometimes they mirror each other, and there are like some differences that apply to the characteristic, the idiosyncratic characteristics of each country. But definitely, one of the common grounds that they have is that extremist narratives regarding gender cannot be disentangled from the narratives about the nation, as we have seen until now. So this is my question to the table, to all four members. Could you tell us something about the historical roots of this phenomenon in your country? Who would like to start?
No pressure.
So,
not me, because I just finished talking.
okay, so
I can
Isidora?
maybe, yeah.
Thank you.
So, concerning Serbia and Croatia, there are two main elements, I think, that make this case a bit different from the others, which can be summarized through the common past of these two countries, which is socialist Yugoslavia, a country that existed from 1945 to 1991. And these are two aspects, socialism and Yugoslavism, which various and unfortunately numerous right-wing groups have been countering to this day. And this could also actually be summarized as what we heard earlier about this erosion on anti-fascist narrative, which is connected to this. Yes. So on the one hand, Yugoslavism as an idea of one Yugoslav nation, as opposed to Serbian or Croatian or other nationalisms in the country, is countered by Serbian and Croatian nationalist building projects today. And particularly important when we think about Yugoslavia is to have in mind that the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s happened through a bloody war, and the legacy of the 90s wars remains crucial for understanding contemporary extremist narratives, especially when it comes to the issue of nation. And on the other hand, during the time of socialism, women had gained significant rights in Yugoslavia. One of them being, for instance, constitutional right for abortion in 1974, and this has been discussed in media a lot recently after the important advance in this regard in France. Although the situation was far from perfect, generations of feminists have contributed much to the struggle of women's rights in both socialist Yugoslavia and earlier in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in the interwar period. And an important legacy in this manner it remains. However, since the 1990s, I would say that with the attempts to erase socialist legacy, there have been attempts for retraditionalization of society in both contexts, and the re-emergence of extremist narratives which tie position of women to the traditional notions of family and nation, which I talked about. They happened also in the context of the war and the rise of militaristic nationalism. So countering of socialist and Yugoslav legacy leads to the recycling of the nationalist and patriarchal tropes and narratives from the 19th century, or alternatively from the 1930s, where there was a rise of nationalist ideologies. And some of the tropes include, for instance, the ideas of Great Serbia, Great Croatia. The church plays an important part as well, especially in the case of Serbian Orthodoxy, which is fused with anti-Western, anti-Semitic, and anti-modernist discourses. And then when concerning gender, in the interwar period, there were also nationalist women's organizations in both Serbia and Croatia, whose discourses were mainly limited to the discussion of women's roles in family and nation, in a similar way as I discussed earlier is the case in contemporary society. And there were many women activists who argued for the rights of women, of only Serbian women or only Croatian women. But actually, if you I looked a bit better into what they were saying, because in historiography it was always a bit presented like they were women's rights activists, but actually if you look at what they were saying, they were just nationalists. There were women who were nationalists, and they were gathering women for the nationalist cause. They were, like, even before the First World War, patriotic women's organizations. What were they doing? Collecting money for the churches in Kosovo. So, I mean, I would really be very careful of seeing, I was very careful when researching to see who actually did argue for women's rights in this case. And this was in the opposition to the feminist movement, which began to be more active from the 1920s, which actually gathered women from the whole Yugoslavia, and it was left liberal, at times also socialist. And their ideas of in the interwar period encompassed the ideas of women's education, suffrage, but even more than that, right for paid employment outside of home, which was, especially in the 1930s, in contrast with the fascist idea of the return to home. So with this retraditionalization and repatriarchalization of society came back again the more conservative ideas whose roots are in the conservative or fascist ideas in the first half of the 20th century and earlier. And just maybe to illustrate this and to conclude, let me mention one of the strangest phenomena recently, the organization in Croatia called Klečaci, those who kneel, with the official name Be Manly, Muževni budite, who can be described as Catholic fanatics who they gather actually once a month to kneel in the squares across Croatia, and they demand something. So what they demand is a nice illustration of like this comeback of narratives. They want homeland, peace, and the conversion of the Croatian nation. They want for men to become spiritual authorities in the family who will bravely witness and transmit the Catholic faith. They want a life of premarital chastity, for chastity in clothing and behavior, and for the renewal of Catholic marriages, for the end of abortion, openness of married couples towards the life, for authentic and uncompromising church pastors, and new spiritual vocations. So we see here to what extent nation and gender are intertwined, and actually we cannot think, we cannot think about the one without the other.
Thank you so much. So I would like to keep hearing your answers, but of course, if you have comments to Isidora's case and otherwise, and Isidora, if later on you have comments on their cases, please jump in so we can make it a conversation. Who would like to keep going? So Claudia, first.
Yes,
thank you.
So, yes, the link between gender and nation is very close. Yes. So I would like to start talk about Elsa Dorland. So Elsa Dorland is a philosopher, French philosopher. She points out in her book La Matrice de la Race, the matrix of the race, that since the 18th century, the nation has been considered as a living organism. Miguel talked about that this morning. So the health of this living organism is also related to the role of women and men had in society. I think everybody knows the theory of the separate spheres. So women belong to the domestic sphere, the home, and men belong to the public and political sphere. The rise of the nation-state goes hand in hand with the defense of the traditional heterosexual family, within the family in France, but also in Spain, in the other Western countries. Women have a fundamental role as mother and educator to their children. I would like to point out that these national and patriarchal ideas also go hand in hand with a racial discourse. Only white women can physically and culturally transmit the national identity. No? That is, for this reason, Elsa Dorlan called her book The Matrix of the Race, no? Because she pointed out the importance of the race in the national discourse about a nation. Furthermore, and then of the 19th century, we start to see the crisis of the nation state linking to the crisis of empire, the decline, no? the thought about the decline. And for many intellectuals at this time, the crisis of the nation is also the result of changes in order roles, in particular with the large presence of women in the public sphere. So the crisis of the nation is also related to the crisis of the masculinity, no? The country's lack of masculinity. So I think now, at this moment, we can see really the relationship between nation, masculinity, and femininity, and the role who women and men are in society. In the 20th century, so the far right, the Front National, start using this idea. According to Alain de Benoit, one of the most famous figures of the new far right, I repeat his word, men and women are biologically different and complementary. The Front National also defends the idea of the family as the foundation of the nation. Women are considered the main transmitter of traditional values. But mother also play a fundamental role to stop the grand remplacement, to stop the great replacement. So, yes, so now I think it's very, yes, we can see the relationship between gender, nation, and the play role by women as mother and transmitter of national identity, but only the white the Catholic women.
Thank you so much, Claudia. So maybe we can switch to this side of the table and let's...
I'll try. Well, it's a complex topic, of course. I'm not going back to the history, of course. It's enough to mention fascism in the case of Italy, but I want to try to go a little bit closer to the present day to mention how, on one side, as you already said, is about the politicization of demography. So, for example, the official National Institute has started to disentangle the birth rate in Italy, the general, from the baby borns from Italians, so from the white women birth rates, Italian women birth rates. Just a statistical, I don't know, neutral indication that you find in the national report. And this is, I think, quite a representative example. And there are many things we can say is about, for example, in the narratives of the far right, there's this kind of reproductive racism that is also linked to the anti-gender narratives. In fact, you find in the manifesto of Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, the mention of the defense from the ideology in the, of gender is in a paragraph dedicated to natality, so to defending the nation in sense of the bodies of the nations. But there are also other aspects related to the self-representation of the nation. And I don't know if Stephen already said about this idea of Italians are very attached to the idea to represent themselves as good people. So in the case of anti-gender, there are these kind of narratives are very good to allow this kind of political stances to get a self-victimizing posture. Because, for example, when back in the 80s, not in the 80s, more in the 90s, when the word of homophobia entered the public debate, it was, let's say, a new stigma that was not easy to avoid for the conservative people. They didn't know how to handle it. And so to find a way that they have nothing against these people, but that now they can blame not the people, but the ideology they are spreading, is a good way to try to match the self-representation of good, deserving citizens, with the idea we are not bad, we are not discriminated. The problem is not the people. We accept everyone, we include anyone. The problem is the ideology of the people. Okay, so there are many layers. I want to mention a last one. Because I think is more or less in all our presentation. We have to recognize that the liberal progressive narratives when it comes to sexual citizenship, so women and LGBT rights, have been dominant before multiculturalism became an issue. I talk about Italy. It was the only frame to become anti-homophobic, to become, to get for gender equality, for a matter of liberalism and modernity. And when migrants came, the right couldn't find a better way to project on others. Okay, we may be the old-fashioned religious people, but look at them. Okay, so this was the shift, the main shift that we find everywhere. So it's relative. We may be backwards, but look at other people. They're even worse. So maybe we are not that worse. And even worse, if you blame us, why you don't blame them? And this is one of the much widespread rhetoric in right-wing politics. And it's easy to them, because the secular rhetorics, the progressive rhetorics that have been later criticized in literature or in activism on homo-nationalism, on femo-nationalism, were not criticized before, when was a war between ourselves, between, let's say, the middle classes, because usually it's the middle class that make the public opinion, so the progressive and the conservative middle classes. Stop here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that is what I would like to say. When we started this report, it was quite obvious that nation was at the heart and that gender was overlapping and that we couldn't study one without the other, as you just say. So it was quite obvious since the beginning. And I think what was striking when we started collaborating with all these different countries, that there were so many similarities when we were looking at the historical roots. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And a lot of similarities, even if I explain that the context of Finland might be a bit different from the other countries. And of course, I don't want to trace back all the history, but there are few elements, because of course, if we are looking at this extremist narrative around the theme of gender, and especially through the prism of political parties and far-right political parties. So in the case of Finland, of course, it's important to mention the Finnish Rural Party that was founded in '59, which is actually the ancestor of the Finns Party. So when the Finnish Rural Party was dissolved, the Finns Party was created, basically. So they, of course, you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. And as Claudia said earlier, a lot of this narrative about gender, they were not considered extremist at that time, because it was just the role of women were very different. And for instance, as you can understand from their name, Rural Party, they were quite conservative, and of course they were professing to hold Christian, traditional Christian values. For instance, they clearly opposed the decriminalization of homosexuality in the 70s in Finland. So it was, of course, quite conservative related to all this topic, and they were defending the traditional ways of life, whatever it might mean, and of course that including traditional gender role, and obviously already at that time, nation and gender were very intertwined in the Finnish political landscape. And when the Finnish Rural Party was dissolved, the Finns Party was founded, and it had, since its creation, a very strong focus on identity politics, and they emphasize very strongly traditional gender roles and family values. And this vision of gender roles, they were aligning with this nostalgia for an idealized, simpler past, the heartland. So both elements were clearly intertwined, and this longing for this like traditional gender role was linked to this idealized past where everything was more simple. We knew you are a man, I'm a woman, we know where we stand, we know what we are supposed to do. Everything was so much more simple, and now talking about all this gender identity is something they can't wrap their head around. So for them, it was a time when the Finnish society was seen as being uncomplicated, whereas these days, everything is too complicated. And this nostalgic heartland is very much connected with this longing for a stable, traditional gender system with home-like qualities. And restoring this pre-feminist gender order with supposedly clean-cut gender roles when everything was super easy has been, of course, on the agenda of the party since its beginning. And the Finns Party and its think tank that I mentioned, this woman, Perusta, they have pushed forward, along with their ethno-nationalist agenda, a traditionalist conception of gender since the very beginning. Of course, it has been maybe a little bit more pink-washed, and everything seems a little bit more mainstream, but they still hold very traditionalist view on gender, and also on the understanding of man, that needs to be at the same time the head of the family, but also the head of the nation. And it is something that is still strongly embedded, and they are, like you really see, how this is interconnected with a nationalistic view. And the aim to keep Finland to ourselves, that is being Finnish, white, and homosexual most of the time, this image of keeping. And just to mention again this example of this neo-fascist party, even if they consider themselves as fascist, but I guess we can call them neo-fascist, the Blue and Black movement, they have both very ethno-nationalist agenda and also very strongly anti-feminist at the same time. And they really have very strong hegemonic views on gender values and patriotism. So you have really like this gender value and patriotic value, they are really enmeshed together, and they cannot be separated. And nation and gender are very much interconnected. And it doesn't come as a surprise that the candidate for the party, they present themselves on social media as quote unquote patriotic wife and stay-at-home mom, or ethno-nationalist family man. I think it's quite a clear example of how nation and gender are really mashed together.
It is. Thank you so much. Now we have 20 minutes before the official end. Can we extend a little bit? Yeah?
We have time until 6:15.
Okay, perfect. Because so maybe we can briefly comment on another topic that came up before, and that keeps coming up as well in the form of questions from the public, because we have noticed the rise of far-right female leaders in Europe, Meloni, Le Pen, Pura, and at the same time, in recent times, nationalist rhetoric has incorporated in some occasions alleged pro-feminist stances, as it is often referred as the phenomenon of feminationalism. So how is the situation in your countries? Who would like to start?
Sarah.
It was a great...
I want to speak about you already said about Italy.
So let's hear other cases. Maybe we can start again with Isidora. Thank you.
Okay. So for me, this is an interesting question, which actually, I mean, it opens a lot of different avenues for research, which I haven't done because I'm not really an expert on right-wing women, but I'm still going to maybe give several examples of how I was thinking about it. And actually, because I'm not an expert in theory on right-wing women, I wanted to mention maybe some examples from, to start by mentioning some examples from popular culture, because this issue has actually been explored, let's say, in recent series, such as there is a character of Serena Joy in Handmaid's Tale, if someone has been watching it, and then there is an example of characters of women who were against equal rights amendment in the USA in the recent series Miss America. And for the latter, I wanted to maybe just give an example where I found interesting this. It's a 10-episode series about how feminists organized to argue, like to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution, whereas there was a movement of women who began to organize against it. And I found it really interesting to see how these women organized and did all the possible political work they could do to argue that women should not do exactly the work that they were doing. And they were actually there is a very interesting conversation there when one of the politician feminists asked them, so okay, so you have learned how to write a program, how to give speeches, how to do interviews, how to write for newspapers. You are doing political work, and this is not something that you should be against. So this paradox is something that is quite interesting to me. And then in the cases of Serbia and Croatia, this paradox was actually explicitly addressed in one documentary about contemporary right-wing parties in Serbia called Desno Desnije, Right More Right. And it's indicative of the way gender narratives are sometimes used by right-wing women. And in this documentary, the journalist Saša Dragojlo had a question to my favorite minister, Milica Đurđević, concerning the historical aspect of right-wing approaches to gender. He asked, how can a woman represent an ideology that, had it been winning historically, you wouldn't be in this position at all, and you wouldn't be talking to me? And she chuckled a bit, and she responded with an implicitly or explicitly anti-European discourse, which is what I found interesting maybe in comparison with what we heard earlier. She said that Serbs have given women suffrage rights before Switzerland, and she pointed out that many who share the lessons of democracy today should take a look at their backyard. So it's actually anti-European somehow discourse of like we are actually better than them in a way. And in a slightly different vein, the former and the first female president of Croatia, Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović of the center-right party HDZ, Croatian Democratic Union, she always found it important to emphasize that she did not think of herself as primarily a woman, and that she was against feminism because she wanted equal opportunities and not advantages for women. So this is, again, something that comes up very often. And maybe one last example, and for me quite interesting actually, that in Serbia the previous prime minister and current president of the parliament, Ana Brnabić, is actually a member of the LGBT community. And her election was initially supported by some members of the LGBTQI+ movement, whereas the others said that a lesbian woman who supported the ruling anti-democratic and populist party, even though she is a member of community, she cannot be seen as an ally. And this is something that I found interesting when the debate was happening, because she basically was a part of this regime that is very problematic in many ways, and I don't want to get into that. But indeed, she has not at all prioritized any LGBTQI+ rights, and she has contributed actually to further devaluating the cause in Serbia, also because people really don't like her, and then somehow they even less like when Pride is happening and she is supporting it in a way. So there is a bit of mishmash now there, like who is on whose side, and who are you supporting if you support her or don't support her, etc. So these are just 3 examples which I wanted to give, but actually I mean there were some more examples, but then I thought in a way that I would be repeating myself and that what I'm saying is boring, but actually it's the thing that it's always the same kind of discourse, and that I think there's not much more to say, that it's always the same narrative in the cases of Serbia and Croatia. So
it's far from being boring.
I mean, it's repetitive, but
yeah,
it's always the same. Like I was like, okay, how many times am I going to mention Kosovo, or I don't know this, but it's what they talk about. So yeah, I will stop with this. So thank you for
Thank you so much. We indeed didn't hear, well, we heard with your explanation about the Finnish case. Would you like to complete?
I can say a little bit more. So I already mentioned that obviously we can see that femo-nationalism is very present in the Finnish and Nordic context. If you look also at Sweden, you find quite a lot the same kind of narrative. And of course, as I also mentioned, there are also strong female leaders in the Finns party, in the far right in Finland. So that's also the same phenomenon that we can see like in France and Italy and other countries. So we have like basically the leader of the party is a young woman. So that of course says something. And I think it highlights also one other dimension. It's that because they are women, they will present themselves as being the true defender of feminism, basically saying that the feminism of this leftist is the extreme form of feminism, but we are the moderate and we are on the side of women because we are not the extremist. So I think it's quite an interesting dimension that we can find in several countries, and of course. We've been talking how, of course, they are also using this kind of narratives to stigmatize Muslim men, but it's also important to mention how they also stigmatize Muslim women, as it has been also mentioned in the keynote, that basically they are stigmatized for being subdued to men, for accepting to be repressed, but at the same time they are also victims of Muslim men because they are forced to wear the veil and to bear a lot of children or all kind of reason. And these Muslim women are portrayed as victims that need to be saved from oppression by the Westerners. So that you can find that kind of discourse quite a lot also in the Finnish context, that basically we are on the side of feminism, we are on the side of women, and we are here also to help these women that are being forced to live in a way that doesn't reflect our values that we share here in the Nordic country, especially as being part of our heritage. And this discourse is, of course, this discourse of liberating Muslim women can be, of course, harmful for these women because it is taking away, of course, their agency. Nobody's asking them what they want and what they are absolutely apparently suppressed to do and not to do. And so, of course, like the perceived notions of gender equality in the Nordic context is quite exceptional, I would say, and tolerant towards gender and sexual minority. But we need also, so we have this image that it is such an egalitarian country, so much liberty, and women are basically there. They can lead the country, and we are in a society that is extremely safe, and so on. So there is a bit of this, like, image, it's idealized image, but there are many things that actually are not reflecting this reality. And we need to challenge this view of as progressive gender equality excludes other bodies most of the time, such as those of migrants and asylum seekers. So it is not as rosy as it may seem on the cover. And yes, of course, we can see femo-nationalism, but also homo-nationalism, because one of the leading figures of the Finns party, Sebastian Tynkkynen, is an openly gay man who is married with a black man who moved to Finland to become a student. And so he is, of course, saying, like, how can we be considered as being extremist and homophobic if one of our main leading figure of the party is a gay man who is living with a black man. So, of course, they are using so they are, of course, again, using this idea that we are progressive, we are for women, we are for gay rights, but when you begin to talk about trans rights, that's where the limit is set. And I think in Finland, there are still a lot of pushback against trans rights. So Finland implemented the first law in 2022 on the basis of the 1972 Swedish law, but including a sterilization clause. So obviously not an ideal situation for trans people. And it took Finland until last year to finally pass a legislation that didn't include this clause. And there's been a lot of pushback, especially from the far right since the law has been passed, and including, of course, the Finns party, which I remind you is in the government right now, so they are co-leading the country, let's put it that way. And the objection to the trans law included several Finns party MPs that have been saying, for instance, that men will use that law to self-declare a change of gender to avoid military service that is still mandatory in Finland, and also to enter women's locker room and saunas, which is very important in Finland. So obviously they have been using this seemingly progressist rhetorics, but in reality, as it has been said many times, it is just a bit of a veneer. But when you scratch a little bit, you notice that the extremist narrative are still very much there.
Thank you so much. I really find fascinating all these cases. We know that Sarah Forrest touched upon Italian and French case, but if you have anything to add, another perspective for...
No, because I would like to talk about the video of Jordan Bardella. So yes, I would like only to say that the France is a very big example of femonationalism. We see this strategy on the part of the far right. I'm referring to the video posted on social network X, by Jordan Bardella, where she presents himself as defender of the women's. He used a series of strategy of femonationalism. He presents himself as a defender of the women's rights, highlighting the freedom to dress as you please. So he referring to the veil, the freedom to dispose of your body. So he referred to Marine Le Pen's support for aiding abortion to the Constitution in June 2024. However, over half of the Rassemblement members of the parliament vote against it. So he says the freedom to dispose of your body, but actually the party vote against, except Marine Le Pen and other members vote against it law. He also pointed out his strong opposition to genital mutilation, which is how often highlighted as a way of denouncing non-European practices. He also made the link between immigration and insecurity. We have also in France, we can see also the phenomenon of homonationalism. So traditionally, the Rassemblement National was a party opposed to LGBTQ rights, but only a few years ago, some members of the party came out as a gay. Julien Audoul, Jean-Philippe Tanguy, Sébastien Chenu, like Philippot before them, also is a strategy to exclude non-European people and especially Muslim. But I don't prepare this answer, so will be a little complicated for me. But I think also it's interesting to note the new far-right groups. How I said before, since the demonstrations against gay marriage, so since the Manif pour tous, a lot of new groups appear called white feminists. They groups use feminist vocabulary. I think it's very interesting because yes, now this group present themselves as the good feminist. Even Maria Maréchal Le Pen present herself as a good feminist. So they use this rhetoric for say we are feminists, but there are different kind of feminists, a good feminist and bad feminist. But I think it's very interesting because for this group, I think there is a contradiction because on the one hand, this group defends traditional values of women, but at the same time, these women have a very important role in this group. So I think we have to talk about this contradiction, maybe or not. It's not a contradiction, but I think it's interesting to see this new group leader by young women who use this rhetoric, feminist rhetoric. So,
yeah, and even the style, because when you see like this Nemesis collective, the way they talk, you could be fooled.
Yes,
It's like I'm following their X page, and it's absolutely fascinating. They really present themselves as a strong young feminists that are really outspoken, and when you look what the case is, like there is just one horrible murder in Paris a few days ago, and they are like been using that like full on because saying you see this again an immigrant that shouldn't have been there, and it is really quite a fascinating how they've been more and more visible in the mainstream media as well, because they are quite they are like they are young, they are pretty, they speak very well, and they bring a lot of controversy when they are invited. So
they also, I thought also about Femen, because a lot of this group present themselves is against Femen. So it's very interesting. This group about good feminism, about feminism.
Thank you so much. Maybe later in the public there will be some questions regarding that. I think Paolo wanted to add.
I try very briefly. One point is the shift that has been debated from the focus on inequality, from that on victimization. In all feminist and LGBT movements. So violence, anti-violence was the only frame in order to claim for rights, and inequality went on a little bit on the background since the 90s, and this in a way has shifted, has allowed, has led this kind of voice easier to emerge, because inequality is not an issue. It's just the right to be safe and so on. This is relevant, but inequality is removed in a way from. So, and that is somehow linked to a debate I heard, I don't handle very well, about a debate within feminism in Italy, but I think also elsewhere, about maternalism. So the idea of a new feminist that doubles the father role, no, with another figure, at the same time, idealistically, with the same power, and but at the end of the day, it doubles the class and racialized relationship that stay behind the idea of is dominate or dominated. And more trivial aspect, I'm not, I mean, we know that linked to the idea of victimization. Finding the repentant people, for example, when it comes to trans affirmative identity and so on, is one of the main strategies. So let's say the ironies of standpoint theory. They always find someone who has the right subjectivity to criticize the agenda of transfeminism in that case. So it is not like random. Is another form of appropriation, because we nominated many appropriations. So it's like ironically also standpoint theory. If you want to speak, you must have this particular subjectivity because it's the evidence of experience, and this is structure. It's always like that. It's not a case.
Thank you so much. And now we give the floor to you for some questions. Maybe we can do it again so that we group the questions so we can answer them. Great. Stephen here. And Natalie.
No, so many thanks for the panel. Very interesting. All the intervention. There's a lot of topic to talk about. I have well, two things now that interest me. One is the case of Alice Weidel. Yeah, that I think in some way represent very well, no, the feminization of the leadership of this party. But then there's also the point of, if you want, the homo nationalism element in some way, because she's lesbian, no, maybe anybody knows here, no, but then her girlfriend is from Sri Lanka, and they have 2 kids adopted, 2 daughters, I think, I don't remember. So I want to say, wow, there's a lot of elements in the figure of Alice Weidel, and then in a party that maybe you, Natalie, this morning you explained, but supposedly is more radical inside the far right family. For me, I think more or less they are the same, broadly speaking. But okay, it's perceived, yeah, it's perceived, no, yeah. But so I don't know if it's not the German case, what you talking about here now in this roundtable, but maybe we can also say something about that. And the other is the case talking about pinkwashing and all this issue that is linked to the case of Israel. I think the case of Israel and the case of the city of Tel Aviv, particularly for the gay the community in the last 30 years, more or less, from the 90s, became like a mecca in some way. And is really interesting. I'm not an expert on that. I've read some studies, but I never make research on that. But about how Israeli, also institution and government use in some way the case of Tel Aviv and that is like a city open to the gay community, etc., etc. So I think it's interesting also to talk about that, because in that case it's also linked to religion in a country that in the last, after 9/11 became like a reference for the far-right movement, because it's like the defender of Western culture in Middle East. And then I don't know if Sarah want to intervene. You start your conference before saying they usually answer make me the question about and what you think about women in Iran. So I had the curiosity to know what's your answer when they ask you that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more questions from the public? Natalie? And Pierre? So, No, Natalie first, then we will hear Pierre, and we are going to answer all together. But if there are more questions, it will be great.
Yeah, so Stephen already mentioned Alice Weidel, because I wanted to mention it too, because it's really an interesting case, because in its programs, the AfD is against abortion, is defending very traditional family roles, and but in the last year, in the past years, we also had this idea that we are there to protect honor, or to protect the German women who are threatened by immigrants. So since 2015, it's also a common threat for this party. What I wanted to say, if I still remember, I'm tired. Yeah, it's about gender and nation, and of course, so in Germany it's obvious, but you have the idea that the traditional family is essential to preserve the identity and the ways. So when you say, you still find this in the program of the Heimat, family is a germ cell of the nation. And what I wanted to say is that today, the gender ideology is also presented. Of course, it threatens the traditional family, so it's a threat for the national identity, but it's also presented, so in Germany, I would say, as something imported from the USA. It's linked to the wokeism or woke ideology, or to cultural Marxism, so something that doesn't belong to Germany, something fremd, I would say in German, and that's an argument. So when I read the tweets of AfD members of other radical organizations, you have always these ideas that it's not something German. That's something from outside that doesn't belong here, and that is linked to Marxism, cultural socialism, and that's why we have to fight against this, because it doesn't belong here.
Funny enough.
It was more a reflection and some.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about the construction of masculinity. I think there is some shift with the colonial and post-colonial context. Before that, the big threat for the masculinity was more the Jewish. I mean, people said that the Jews were too soft, were homosexuals, were with sexual appetite, everything. So there is some shift, but I mean, there is always discourses about the Jewish person now, right now in France and Finland. This is common to speak about Jewish people as a threat for masculinity, or not at all?
Jewish people?
Yeah, Jewish people. There is a rest of anti-Semitism about masculinity. Yes?
That's an easy, like, I don't know if we can...
For
yes.
Finland and France and other countries. This is a general question.
Sadly, thank you so much. Sadly, we will stop the questions here, because we have really until 6:15 for answering. So let's do a very fast round of all of us. So if you have anything to say, we can do that. Okay.
Well, I can just answer to your question very quickly. The answer is yes, especially in the most extreme. So, like for this neo-fascist party that I mentioned, the Blue and Black movement, in their manifesto, it's extremely anti-Semite. Yes, you will not find that of course, in the program of the Finns party, because but in some of the members can be. On their individual level, can be anti-Semite, but you have to go more to the fringes, but it is still there, but definitely.
Thank you. So,
in the French case, well, I work on French case since 1 year, so I don't know maybe, but I didn't find the relationship between masculinity and Jewish. I don't know, but I think the anti-gender narratives are linking also about masculinity. Sarah talked about it's very important to talk about masculinity because it's gender. So I think all these kind of discourse are linked about now in France there are a lot of masculinism group, the far right group who defends the traditional masculinity. So this kind of discourse we can analyze this discourse without take account of masculinity. Discourse about masculinity is really linked.
I would say for the German case, it works as a part of the more radical groups. I would say the Heimat and neo-Nazis. It's still the case.
Maybe, but now it's just the men are weak because of woke culture. Because but I don't know. Maybe before nowadays I don't see this link, but maybe before, yes.
Yeah, probably in some very marginal fringe groups, perhaps neo-Nazi.
Yes, but
then again, I'm not a specialist of that case.
And would you like to comment something very briefly about the cases of Alice Weidel, case of Tel Aviv, or wokeism and cultural Marxism in Germany?
All wrapped up in one answer.
Because I wanted to say that I forgot because I'm tired. Just that we maybe shouldn't forget that women always played a role in extremist groups. It was something that were neglected, but I have a colleague who wrote a PhD about women in the National Democratic Party since the 60s, and also how women supported National Socialism. It was something that was neglected
In front
time.
of the same.
But and that feminism, like you said, Sarah, is always plural. And the feminist movement in Germany around 1900, it was also very full. There were conservative women, and there were socialist and women, and there were sometimes very different revendications things.
But in France it's the same.
That could be also interesting regarding roots of these narratives.
Claudia just said in France is the same.
Yes, it is the same. There were a lot of women in conservative party, in Catholic, and yes, in far right. Yes, always there was a lot.
So we would like to stop it here and we continue this discussion in a more informal setting.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here. Thank you so much for your attention and your implication until the end.
Tomorrow.
No me he escuchado nada.
Bueno.
Ah, okay. So, okay. So, all right. So, particularly for the people online, but here as well for the people that are in person. So, we will restart tomorrow at 10 with the conference about science. So, thank you so much, Don Camille Ungerenau. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.